friends, colleagues, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by paying tribute both to our security forces and to men and women in uniform from many countries among our allies, particularly the United States. And of course, Australia, where a museum in Sydney honors those brave soldiers and officers who fought shoulder to shoulder with us. Over 1 million American men and women in uniform have fought with us, lived with us, and it's an extraordinary pleasure that when I see them, they say they've left their heart in Afghanistan. This is an extraordinary tribute to our people, because the welcome that the people of Afghanistan have accorded to our international partners is unique. We're at a moment of change, a radical change in context. And we have two ways of having a conversation. One is to dwell on the past. Another is to take stock of today and this opportunity and really focus on the prospects of the future. Briefly on the past. When I was sworn in as Afghanistan's president, we dealt with a radical uncertainty as our overwhelming context. President Obama had publicly announced that American troops will be reduced to 600, and departure was proceeding very rapidly, per our desire. And as the person who had headed the security transition, I was determined to finish the security transition in Afghanistan, which we did on time on December 31, 2014. Our first attempt in that context was to raise the issue of peace. And peace for us is meant a double process of peace. First and foremost, peace between the states of Afghanistan and the states of Pakistan. This peace is fundamental to creating stability and, following that, prosperity both in South and Central Asia. So I reached out, and we all reached out, the Government of National Unity, my colleague Dr. Abdullah, all my colleagues. But unfortunately, the last 2.5 years were not productive on that quest. Instead, we had to fight. And I hope it has become clear that the Afghan security and defense forces have fought with determination, with valor, and with distinction. Let me just highlight how some of our forces are doing extraordinary things. On May 31st this year, 5 Afghan policemen at the diplomatic quarter in Kabul saw a truck bomb heading towards the German embassy. It was a question of decision of minutes. They decided to sacrifice themselves, causing the truck to implode before it would hit the German embassy. Hit the truck, hit the German embassy and its surrounding embassies, Kabul probably would have had the unfortunate distinction of entering the Guinness Book of Records as the slaughterhouse of international diplomatic prisons. These men did not hesitate. This type of story recurs with enormous regularity. We have fought hard because we had to. But also, what is extraordinary is that in a moment of fighting, we've been able to carry significant reforms. And the reform of the Ministry of Defense is a tribute again to the imagination of my colleagues. Particularly, I'd like to single out Minister Atmar, my colleague National Security Advisor, and my other colleagues for their enormous work to making sure that one of the most successful generational transitions in our history in security forces is underway. Our Minister of Defense is under 40. He is not part of the generational quarrels of the 1980s, 1970s, 80s, and 90s. This generational transformation is taking place both in the civilian and security sector in Afghanistan, and it is quite significant. So the news, because always the question is asked, this percentage of country, that percentage of country, under whose control, etc. What I want to put the equation is simple. The Afghan army has been able to take every single district within days. Our problem has been holding. And holding has been because our police is not substantially reformed and is not at the capacity. But this is changing, and hopefully we'll be able to move. So coming to the present. But before that, the dominant characteristic of the president is what I call the fifth wave of political violence. Terrorism is not new. Mr. Zakaria has written on this, he knows a lot better. But beginning with anarchism, this is the fifth wave. What is new is the way. All previous waves were based on secret societies, face-to-face networks. This is a Facebook to faceless networks. It is an extraordinary combination of transnational networks, transnational criminal organizations, and transnational cyber security linkages. What we need to take account of is if the previous waves are to go by, this is not going to be a phenomena or a challenge of a year or two. It is more likely to be a challenge of a decade or 2 decades. The politics necessary, the international coordination necessary to deal with this requires a different perspective, and I hope we can rise to that challenge. The other components of the security are regional and domestic, and in that context, I'd like to welcome the announcement of the South Asia strategy by the Trump administration. The number of troops. So first, clarifications. The increase in the number of troops is modest. Second, I want to assure every American parent that American forces are not going to be involved in combat. The security transition is not being reversed. The increase in troops is within the limits and understandings of the bilateral security agreement and the strategic partnership agreement. What is new is bringing all instruments of American power to the equation. It's the combination of diplomacy and also economic engagement that makes this distinctive. Because of this, the opening is to a comprehensive dialogue between Afghanistan and Pakistan on the one hand, and in the context of the quadrilateral dialogue between Afghanistan, Pakistan, United States, and China on the other. It is a unique opportunity for the leadership of Pakistan to discuss with us the legacy of the past and a determination not to repeat the past, but to overcome the past. Securing the future of South Asia is enormously significant because tens of millions of people who live today in poverty as a result of our common understanding could see their pathway towards prosperity. As Mr. Brad said, the role of the Asia Society across. But we look at Asia being located at its heart. And being at the heart means something very simple. The Asian continental economy will not come together unless Afghanistan is made whole. The shortest way between different parts of Asia is to go through Afghanistan. And what we focused on, and this, again, is a significant difference, all our neighbors, near and far, with the exception of Pakistan until now, have been engaged in a very intense and productive dialogue. That dialogue in the context of this strategy will be intensified, and we will be able to move forward. The goal, the overarching goal of the strategy, into which the Afghan government and people are dedicated, is a political settlement. And this political settlement, again, has two parts. One, state-to-state understandings and the primacy of state-to-state relationship in contrast to reliance of non-state actors, particularly malign non-state actors. And second, an offer of political dialogue to Taliban. It should be clear to various Taliban groups that they cannot win in the military field. Were it be possible, it would have happened in the last years where we were fighting under enormous constraints. Today, with the support and clarity of support that is provided, a military victory for them is impossible. Second, they need to realize that they're losing the people of Afghanistan. Each atrocity that is committed, each violation of human rights, each attack on a mosque, a shrine, a village, a women's network, etc., is alienating people further. We need, however, to prepare our society for peace, because peace must lead to stability. It's not every type of peace that we seek, but a peace that can bring enduring stability to us and to the region. To make sure that an Afghan can prove an Australian wrong, I end my comments, and I welcome Fareed Zakaria for a conversation.
Mr. President, let me start by saying, welcome, President Ghani.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for what you're doing for global engagement and dialogue. You are a voice of reason and understanding, and it's a pleasure to interact with you.
You're trying to soften me up. And
that has never worked with you, so it's meant genuinely.
Let me begin by asking you a few personal questions. You're an academic by training. You've worked in the development field, in the World Bank. You've lived as a scholar in the United States. Here you are, the president of one of the most difficult war-torn countries in the world, with incredibly complex tribal politics, corruption, international politics with the United States, Russia, China. How difficult was that transition?
It wasn't difficult. It was close to impossible. No, seriously, I'm an accidental president, because my life has been a preparation for this job. I spent 14 years of my life looking at the last 600 years of Afghan history. I've traveled to every single province of Afghanistan during the security transition. I know the history, the feelings, I hope, of each segment, each strata of Afghan population. And I was raised on patriotic textbooks, a sense of Afghanistan as an entity with 2,000 to 5,000 years of history, a place where the poetry of Rumi still sounds, where Khushal Khan's call to action still echoes, and where Amir al-Shir Nawai's call for justice is still very prevalent. The second part is my country needs representation. And the other part, which has been, the World Bank, Johns Hopkins, Berkeley, etc., comes to use because we've had a problem. We've always won in the battlefield, but we've not been able to represent ourselves and speak for ourselves politically. Now we are capable. We have an entire generation that is connected and is able. And the third area is reform. I inherited a system where corruption was the system. So tackling it, articulating and moving and arriving at a sense. Our problems are chain-linked. And when you have chain-linked problems, the weakest chain determines your momentum. But you had to sequence. And prioritizing has been immensely. Where I'm privileged and has made the job much easier is the team, the interaction and the ability to discuss. So we've created fora, they're called councils, where we really are discussing and coordinating. And when I look at the face of young soldiers, I'll give you a very small vignette to allow other questions. It used to break my heart. Each time I went to the Army Corps, the cadets were shorter than me. The problem of stunting in our country. I've been through 6 Army Corps. Last month, for the first time, I'm finding soldiers and non-commissioned officers that are taller than me. This is a vote in the future. You know, they've fed, and it reflects. So to win the world for those who do not have voice, which is the absolute majority of the Afghans, 40% of our people live below $1.35. But to deliver on the aspiration is an inspiration that keeps me going.
So everybody knows you are spotless. Even your worst enemies don't accuse you of corruption. But you preside over what is regularly regarded as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. How do you change that? And how do you function effectively without being corrupt? If the corruption has been the grease that made Afghanistan work, aren't you handicapped by your honesty?
No, because corruption has not made Afghanistan work. Corruption robbed us of 2 chances. The first was after 9/11. The people of Afghanistan had hope. I traveled all across Afghanistan. I went after 24 years on 26th of December 2001. I traveled 10 provinces of Afghanistan without any school. It's corruption that took away the hope. And second, one of the largest interventions in history under President Obama's first term took place in Afghanistan, but again, the Afghan elite did not do its job. So to make the argument that corruption greases the wheels and make it function, no, it's the opposite. It's deprived the majority, it has exacerbated the gap between the rich and poor, and sudden wealth it came to people without that accountability for it. If we don't, the desire of our people, why did the people vote for me? Precisely because I had an anti-corruption agenda. People of Afghanistan are not corrupt. A small elite indulge in corruption, and now we are coming, and every action that we are taking against corruption is welcomed. We've created a Center for Justice. And for the first time, high-ranking officials, civilian and military, are being indicted.
Why is it not reflected in the rankings of, say, Transparency International?
Because it takes time. It takes time. I think in 2 years, you will see, hopefully, very significant shifts. And what we did, an excellent question, thank you for it. Transparency International ranks functioning systems. When corruption itself, and unfortunately, there are at least 50 countries where corruption is the rule, not the exception. When you're doing the foundational work, it does not reflect itself immediately in the ranking. So one part, for instance, is completely based on the stroke of pen reforms. Those we could not focus on at first because we need to focus on cleaning up security. So the sequencing and ranking are 2 different. Now, last week, we finished a comprehensive anti-corruption strategy. I think as a result of this, you will see it. Second, the rankings take place in the middle of the year. So the efforts that you've done in the last 6 months of the year only reflected in the next year, not in the current year.
But let me go back to your lack of political experience. So people would look at a place like Afghanistan and think, you'd need to be some kind of tribal chief. And after all, your predecessor did come from a very important family, from an important tribe. You need to have the ability to arm wrestle people in various ways. As I say, perhaps give them some patronage money. Did you find that you had to develop some skills like that, which surely at Johns Hopkins and the World Bank you didn't need?
Well, look, I was raised on the knees of my grandfather. He came from one of the largest clans in this country. and the mediation skills that were required. The old Afghan political elite, prior to the 40 years, was linked. It was networked. It had an ethos that had been formed during centuries. Sense of justice, sense of fair play, etc. obey. So one part comes from that. When I had a visitor once, a journalist, and he interviewed me, and he asked me questions in English, so I responded in English. And he wrote that said that international vocabulary rolled from my lips. Another time, he saw me with students of Kabul University, and I was speaking in Pashto in Dari, and he was stunned that I could communicate. Part of the problem is perception. International commentators classify us. If we speak English, they think we don't know how to speak our own languages. And when we speak in our own languages, they get to be surprised.
I guess the question is, are you tough enough? Do you have the ability to drag dead bodies across the room to show people in Afghanistan that you can do business?
You don't need to drag dead bodies. You need to implement rules. We have had enough of death and destruction. No, seriously. I mean, my problem was the opposite. I had the reputation as finance minister of being so tough that people thought they would vote for me, but they were afraid that I'd be so tough that I'll break the system. What has pleasantly surprised them is flexibility within principle.
You are one of the few world leaders, I think, who has generally been happy with the Trump administration.
I am.
And have you had any personal interactions with the president?
Absolutely.
How does he strike you?
We've had wonderful conversations, flowing.
And he seems, just give me a sense of your perception of him from those phone conversations.
Engaged, informed, and determined to see and hear. But it requires immense preparation. If you want to keep him engaged, you better be informed and communicate everything significant in 2 minutes. It's the standard thing that you're formed. When one comes on your program, the first training that I got when I interacted with Fareed Zakaria was that if you have a message, don't take more than 2 minutes to deliver. It's the same with President Trump.
I will take that as a compliment.
It is. It's meant as what.
Is his strategy significantly different from President Obama's? After all, the number of troops that seem to be increased is not very significant.
It is different. I think several differences are involved here. First, with all modesty, President Obama did not have a partner in Afghanistan. President Trump is not just an individual, a team as partners in Afghanistan. We own our problems today. No one has to preach to us about corruption being an evil. No one has to compel us to saying that your security sector needs reform, your justice sector needs reform, your economy. And particularly, no one needs to tell us that you need to reach out to the region. After 117 years, Afghanistan is firmly a part of Central Asia again. Central Asia, for the first time, is looking south. The second element is that President Obama, for whom I have enormous respect and appreciation, because he really, the reappraisal of his strategy in light of the sacrifices of our forces and our commitment was the foundation for the current administration's approach. We cannot ignore that. And, President Obama asked as tough a series of questions as President Trump did. But at the end, he changed his mind and renewed the commitment, which ensured our survival.
And you were not president at that time?
No, I was president.
You were?
I was. It's after 2014.
14, okay.
Because during that time, in 2014...
You're not referring to the original...
No, I'm speaking... The original strategy was arrived internally.
Right.
The Trump administration strategy is at the uniqueness of immense consultation with us.
But again, how is it different?
How is it different? It's different in the sense that it focuses on the fundamental political regional problem. The examination of Pakistan has never been as thorough, and the message for the need for Pakistan to engage and become a responsible stakeholder in the region and in the fight against terrorism has never been this clear.
And the key here is, just so our viewers understand, that right now you have many forces that fight Afghan National Army and Americans in the old days, and then would retreat to Pakistan, where they had safe havens, where they were essentially protected by the Pakistani military. You really think this will change after, really 40 years?
Well, this is the fundamental issue. If we want to indulge in the past, a test of leadership is when context changes, do you repeat the past or do you move forward and seize the present? What I'm offering the Pakistan government, the Pakistan security apparatus, is the invitation to a comprehensive dialogue. Afghans are determined to fight. Nobody thought I'd be able to perform the role of the commander-in-chief, but I'm extraordinarily proud of my relationship with Afghan troops, with Afghan officers, with Afghan non-commissioned officers. We have demonstrated that we have the will. No one should mistake our will to defend our country. The sense of patriotism is immense and it's cross-cutting. But simultaneously, no one should underestimate our wish for a secure region. Afghanistan is our tragedy is we're potentially one of the richest countries on earth, given our size and population, with our natural resources, natural capital, mining, and potentially oil and gas, etc. But the cost of war is intense and immense. Every day I put a piece of stone in my heart, because when I get the casualty figures, and particularly the destruction of our civilian life, Kabul under attack, etc. So here is the opportunity. If Pakistan does not take this opportunity, I think they will pay a high price. So I hope that it's their interest to engage.
What should we make of the reports we get that 46% of the country is under Taliban control? Or you see a report that says every time American forces and Afghan national forces withdraw from some village or area, it is taken over by the Taliban. It seems to give a sense of hopelessness to those who want to support Afghanistan.
Well, this is product of the slam dunk remark on Iraq. It's because of the way figures are kept. So an enemy now, the CIA and related intelligence agencies are so careful to record every armed group attack, but they don't report back on when territory is taken back. Second, the Taliban have not been able to take a single province. Their aim in 2014, when I became president, was twofold. One, to bring the government down. And that was their universal belief, that the Afghan army won't fight, the Afghan political class will be too divided, that the economic transition would be too hard, etc. No success. Second, to divide the political geography into two, so that they would have a province minimally, or at least their ultimate goal was 5 to 6 provinces. They've not succeeded in this. Is fighting been hard? Absolutely. But if you look at the fighting in 2015, 2016, and 2017, our armed forces today are in the best position they've been in the last years. Additionally, 100,000 American and international troops with hundreds of planes, helicopters, etc., were fighting between 2009 and 2014. They all left. We filled the gap. And it's like a teenager suddenly taking responsibility for a family and having to perform the job of a 30-year-old. We have grown, and institutionally we've changed. Where is the weakness? The strength is that the Afghan army, particularly our commando force, that are second to none in the region, are able to take every single location in the country. We've not had the police forces with the capability to hold them.
So our next phase of reform is precisely oriented towards the police.
But it's not that the Taliban have political support in these areas?
No, they don't.
They don't.
They don't. On the contrary, Taliban are becoming less and less popular. They've gone, it's a sign of weakness to attack a mosque. It's a sign of weakness, not strength, to kill people, soldiers who are praying. It's a sign of weakness to attack civilians in broad daylight. Blowing bombs, truck bombs particularly, does not make you popular. They need to understand that society does not support violence, particularly a society that has suffered 40 years of violence. So as a result, look at any public survey. This is the most unfortunate consequence of this, is that now that the diplomatic environment has become feasible for peace, public attitudes towards peace might harden. We need to engage back with our population in intense dialogue because the wounds are too fresh. I have to take the long view, but how am I to explain to a person who's lost his sister, to a mother who's lost her child, to a husband whose wife is blown to bits, to a grandfather whose grandson, or vice versa? This, the Taliban did not calculate, and their supporters needed to advise them much better. The other component we need to really come to, what's driving the war? Without drugs, this war would have been long over. This is another component, which is transnational crime, because the heroin is a very important driver of this war. Colombia has been extremely useful for me as a point of reference, both under President Urabi and under President Santos, because if we don't understand the linkage between transnational crime and transnational terrorist organization, where does their financing come?
So how do you end that? Afghanistan has the unenviable distinction of being the world's largest opium producer.
Indeed. But this is precisely where we need to focus, to make sure the potential, the economic potential is immense. Regional economic cooperation will provide an alternative. Thailand was able to do this, one of the few countries that did it successfully. We can move to a different dynamic. But the fundamental issue is to take the political factor out of the criminal factor. Because today, crime is justified.
Meaning what? Explain how you...
Meaning engaging in a peace process, making sure that there are no sanctuaries, no networks of support, and that when we face terrorism, and unfortunately the problem of terrorism is a different problem. It's a more medium-term problem. Then people can rally in support of that. But when it's mixed with the elements of domestic disputes bordering on a civil war, etc., it complicates. This complexity will be reduced so that then we can focus on the threat of transnational terrorism and transnational crime with a much more coherent focus and approach.
When Americans heard President Trump's decision to expand both the number of troops and also the rules of engagement, I think many of them thought, will this ever end? What was your message? What are the conditions under which you imagine American troops can withdraw? And do you think that that will happen anytime soon?
Well, first of all, American troops are not re-engaging in combat. The security transition that was completed in 2014 is not being revisited.
So they're just they're training.
They're training, they're advised, train, and assist mission. Except for counterterrorism, that's a different phenomenon. We cooperate with each other. Second, the number is very modest. During President Obama, it was a massive surge in increase in numbers. So this is a sustainable proposition. Third, we have a 4-year plan. It's in support of that 4-year plan that we articulated, and I'd like to pay tribute to General Nicholson and all his colleagues, the commander of the military forces, as well as the key generals in the past, General Dunford, Votel, Scaparati, Thomas, and others, who've all served. We have Fareed, we have had the advantage that American generals know us extremely well because they're all, a very significant number of them are veterans of Afghanistan, including Secretary Mattis, who was among the first to arrive in Kandahar, and General Kelly, who lost his son in Helmand. The advantage of this knowledge is that they can discern both intention and performance. We have convinced a very hard jury that reform of our security forces is real. Today, a 3-star Afghan general, for the first time in our history, is serving a prison sentence because in Helmand he misused fuel that was intended for soldiers. This has convinced them. Within the 4-year plan, we think we can consolidate. And the second component that is most important is the political clarity of the South Asia strategy. And third is the wider regional realignment that is taking place. The region is seriously concerned about the threat of terror, and hence both our work, for instance with China. When I became president, it was my privilege to facilitate a trilateral dialogue, and it got formalized between China, United States, and Afghanistan. This outreach is creating the grounds. I think we are not talking decade or long, we are talking some limited years.
What do you say to the 1 million plus Americans who have now served at some point in Afghanistan?
Well, first, I'm saying thank you. I've always said thank you to them, and we're extraordinarily grateful to these men and women. Second, I say their sacrifices are not going to be in vain. People like the son of General Kelly, who stepped on a mine in Helmand, or Jane's husband. Jane is a distinguished lady that works with our embassy in Washington with veterans, whose husband lost his life in Zurmad. We're saying that what you sacrificed for is now bearing fruit. The Afghan army is not going to collapse. The Afghan society is not going to collapse. Third, we're saying what you provided in the way of training and advice is now being institutionalized. Our non-commissioned officers are all product of post 9/11. All our soldiers are product of post 9/11. Now our senior officers and our generals are becoming product of post 9/11. Our society was dominated by the generation of 1960s until now. The generation of 1990s is now stepping forward, and this is a generation that really is in the 21st century and coming together. So my message to the veterans is thank you for your support. We need your moral support, and we are looking forward to receiving you with your families anytime. Our hearts have a very big space for you, and you would always be welcome to interact with us.
Final question. You have now seen this phenomenon as an academic, as a World Bank official, and now as president of Afghanistan. What is your answer to people who say, why is there so much terrorism in Muslim countries? What is the cause of Islamic terrorism?
Well, first of all, if you go back to the first wave was totally in Christian countries.
You're talking about 100 years ago?
No, not 140 years ago. Anarchism. Anarchism was a predominantly Euro-American phenomenon, originated in Russia, but Sako-Envetsiti, etc. Second, the second wave was a wave of national liberation. Africa got engaged and Asia got engaged. Look at Sri Lanka. Buddhism, the most peaceful, and now look at Myanmar. The third wave involved students.
60s, Maoism.
60s, Maoists, and American, Black Panthers, Japanese. Terrorism cannot be related to a particular religion. On Islam, first on Islam, the key issue is we, the leaders of the Muslim world, have not spoken enough, have not taken responsibility. I have the privilege of representing Rumi.
The great Afghan poet.
The great Afghan poet, the birthplace. He is a poet of... if the Muslim world had only contributed Rumi to the global civilization, it would be enough. It echoes. The number of people who read Rumi and are inspired by him is limitless.
And it's a message of love.
It's a message of love. It's a message of engagement. It's a message of harmony. Our problem is the expression that Naipaul used for India of the 1960s, I think applies to the Muslim world. We're a wounded civilization. And part of the difficulty is that we've forgotten our enlightenment. Fred Starr has done an immense work for us, for everybody, having written a book on Central Asia called The Forgotten Enlightenment. The history of science and civilization in China is immensely known, but the history of science and civilization in the Muslim world is just being scratched. We need to know that 1,000 years ago, we were a self-confident civilization. We had no difficulty translating Greek books or incorporating Roman law or bringing Indian mathematics or others. This civilizational engagement is important. The other is unemployment. Several hundred million people in the youth that are unemployed.
In the greater Middle East.
In the greater Middle East. And this problem needs handling, so the complexity of it. And then there's anger. Anger that has been interpreted because the issue is 20th century was not kind to the Arab Muslim world. Most of the hot wars of the 20th century took place, and this is brought a reinterpretation with the so-called clash of civilization. So a comprehensive engagement is required to make sure that we can deal with a phenomenon of violence that is morphing, that is not new, but is significantly changing because of the changed circumstances, and it requires coordinated action. But the other fight is that it's not just killing. You need to empower people. You need to engage in a civilizational dialogue. You need to have a comprehensive approach. And women, of course. Afghanistan had the horrible distinction of having experienced gender apartheid. Now, our Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs is here. Women in the cabinet, we have 6 ambassadors across. But still, our gender performance stinks because of the past. We need to be able to handle these things. The most significant message I take is we have to speak truth to each other. Engage in a dialogue that is non-confrontational within our societies. Analyze ourselves, find a way, and form the partnerships. The rest of the world is not our enemies. The West is not our antagonist. We are now engaged in a truly global quest for stability, and I hope very much that we would be able to rise to the occasion the way the wise men and women of 1945 did. It requires a vision. The thing that is lacking globally is a sense of the future. Human beings are not one-dimensional. You don't live in the present. You have to have a sense of destination. And I think when destination is articulated, the way we are beginning, I hope, to articulate in Afghanistan, would be able to move forward.
President Ghani, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have to say, I think that there's nobody on the world stage today who can combine the level of academic and deep scholarly knowledge you have with, as I say, this practical skills that you have somehow developed and mastered. I think it's an enormous tribute, and it's a great honor and privilege to see, and I think the Afghan people are very lucky.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.